Dodge City, Kansas, September 8, 1887. A woman stood waist-deep in a rectangular pit carved from frozen prairie, throwing shovels of earth onto a pile that grew larger with each passing hour. The hole measured 8 feet wide by 12 feet long by 6 feet deep. She had measured it 3 times with a surveyor's chain she'd found among her husband's tools. Precision mattered. She knew this the way she knew the temperature of Earth below the frost line stayed constant at 55 degrees winter and summer, regardless of what hell or heaven the surface endured. Her name was Moira Callahan. She was 35 years old. The neighbors who rode past on their way to town crossed themselves in whispered prayers for the widow who had clearly lost her mind to grief. They didn't stop to ask what she was building. They thought they already knew. They thought she was digging her own grave. The autumn sun angled low across the prairie, casting long shadows from the scattered homesteads that dotted the landscape like chess pieces on an infinite board. Smoke rose from 47 chimneys in the township, each one burning through 6 to 8 cords of wood every winter at $8 per cord, $48 to $64 just to keep a family from freezing. The math was simple. The cost was not. But in 92 days, on January 12, 1888, the worst blizzard in Kansas history would arrive without warning. The temperature would drop to 47 degrees below zero. Wind would reach speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. Visibility would reduce to nothing. And in that crucible of cold that would kill dozens across the plains, inside the structure Moira Callahan was building, the temperature would hold steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, without a fire, for 8 hours straight. In Cornelius Hartwell's frame house, just 2 miles east, built with the finest lumber his sawmill could provide, the indoor temperature that same night would barely reach 18 degrees, with his cast-iron stove running at full capacity. His 6-year-old daughter, Millicent, would wake with frostbite on her toes. His wife, Martha, would wrap the child's feet in wool and pray. The town doctor would document the case in his records, along with 22 others from that single storm. Hartwell would burn through 2.5 cords of wood in those 72 hours, $20 worth, a quarter of his winter fuel budget consumed in 3 days. But Moira Callahan would use 1/8 of a cord, $1 worth, and she would sleep warm. The question that would haunt many men for the rest of their days was this: what did an Irish widow with nothing but grief and a book understand about the physics of shelter that an entire frontier town of experienced builders had missed? The answer lay in what she was building, and in where her grandfather had taught her people to build 1,000 years before America even had a name. 5 months earlier, cholera had moved through the Callahan household like a scythe through wheat. Declan, first her husband of 12 years, gone in 2 days. Then, Aisling, 8 years old, who loved pressing prairie flowers between the pages of the family Bible. Then, Brennan, 5, who slept with his thumb in his mouth and his blanket clutched to his chest. 4 days total. 3 pine boxes lowered into the ground behind the church on a morning so bright and cloudless it seemed like a cruel joke. Moira had stood at those graves for hours each day in the weeks that followed, talking to headstones that never answered, asking questions that had no good answers. Why them and not me? What am I supposed to do now? How do I live in a world that doesn't have them in it? The soddy provided no comfort. Every corner held memories. The spot where Declan had read to the children by candlelight. The shelf where Aisling kept her flowers. The tiny bed where Brennan had slept. Moira couldn't look at any of it without feeling the grief rise up and threaten to drown her. She had thought about joining them. On the darkest nights, lying alone in the dwelling that still smelled like her children, she had thought about it quite seriously. But then she remembered something her grandfather had told her when she was a girl in County Clare. They had been walking among the ancient stone beehive huts that dotted the Irish countryside, structures that had stood for more than 1,000 years without a single nail or drop of mortar. "The old ones knew something we've forgotten," he had said, running his weathered hand over the corbelled stones. "They knew how to make shelter, not by fighting the earth, but by understanding it. They built down instead of up. They used stone instead of timber. They worked with weight and gravity instead of against it. And what they built outlasted kingdoms." Declan had brought home a traveler's account of those structures 2 years before he died. A book with detailed illustrations of the corbelling technique, showing how each layer of stone projected slightly inward until they met at the center, held in place not by mortar, but by the weight of the stones themselves, pressing down and in, creating a compression that made the whole stronger than any individual part. Declan had been proud of his Irish heritage, even though he'd been born in Boston and had never seen the green hills his grandparents spoke of with such longing. He had shown Moira the illustrations pointing to the domed roofs that had weathered centuries. "Our ancestors knew how to build," he had said. "They didn't need lumber or fancy materials, just stone and patience and knowledge passed down through generations." Moira thought about those illustrations during the long nights after the funerals, when sleep wouldn't come and the soddy walls seemed to close in around her. The prairie had no trees for lumber, but it had stone. Endless deposits of flat limestone that broke naturally into slabs, perfect for building. It had earth that stayed a constant temperature below the frost line, warmer than any above-ground structure could manage without burning through a fortune in firewood. It had wind that would destroy any conventional building she might attempt, but couldn't touch something buried beneath its reach. And it had her, a woman with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. She decided to build something new, something that had never held her family, never witnessed their laughter or their deaths, something that would be hers alone, for better or worse. The first week was the hardest. The ground resisted her shovel, packed tight by years of prairie grass roots that formed a mat inches thick. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over into something tougher than the skin she'd been born with. Her shoulders screamed, each night muscles burning from labor they'd never been asked to perform. She fell into her bed in the soddy exhausted and woke before dawn, unable to sleep more than a few hours, because the nightmares always found her. In the nightmares, she was back in that room, watching Declan's face go gray as the fever took hold, watching Aisling cry for water that wouldn't stay down, watching Brennan stop breathing with a sound so small she almost missed it. She would wake, gasping, reaching for children who weren't there, and lie in the darkness until morning came, because going back to sleep meant going back to that room. The digging was a mercy. It gave her something to do with her hands, her body, her mind, her ew. It gave her a reason to get up each morning that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future. The hole in the ground grew deeper, and somehow, impossibly, The hole in her chest grew smaller. By September 22nd, 14 days after she'd started, the pit was complete. A neat rectangle carved from the prairie, its walls showing the layers of soil and clay and limestone that made up the bones of the land. 576 cubic feet of earth removed. She had calculated it precisely. 8 feet times 12 feet times 6 feet. The numbers mattered because in construction, unlike in grief, precision could be measured and verified and trusted. Moira stood at the bottom and looked up at the sky, feeling for the first time in months that she might actually survive this. On September 25th, Cornelius Hartwell rode out to see what the widow was building. Hartwell was 42 years old, owner of the only sawmill within 30 miles. He had built his business on the simple fact that everyone needed lumber for houses, for barns, for fences, for fuel. The demand was constant. The margins were good, and he employed 8 men who depended on those wages to feed their families. He had no particular ill will toward Moira Callahan. But when word reached town that she was building some kind of underground stone structure, he felt a responsibility to understand what that meant. Not just for safety, though that was part of it, but for the economic foundation of the entire community. He dismounted at the edge of the pit and looked down at Moira, who was arranging limestone slabs she'd hauled from the creek bed 2 miles east. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, removing his hat. "I was sorry to hear about Declan and the little ones. Cholera took good people this year." "Too many good people." Moira looked up. Her face was streaked with dust, her hands wrapped in cloth strips where the blisters had broken. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Folks in town are talking about what you're building. Underground shelter with a stone roof, they say. I wanted to see it for myself." "You're looking at it." Hartwell studied the pit, the stacked stones, the evidence of careful planning. "Mrs. Callahan, I need to be direct with you. My concern isn't personal. It's practical. If you're planning what I think you're planning, a corbelled stone roof underground, there are implications beyond just your own safety." "What implications?" "Economic ones. My sawmill provides lumber for 47 families in this township. If you succeed in building a shelter that keeps you warm using minimal firewood, and if others follow your example, that's a significant portion of my winter sales gone. I have 8 employees. Their families depend on my business staying viable." It was the most honest statement of self-interest Moira had heard since Declan died. No pretense of concern for her welfare, just straight economics. She respected that. "So you're here to ask me to stop. I'm here to understand what you're attempting, and to tell you that if you're right, if this works, it changes everything, for better or worse. Mr. Hartwell, my husband burned through 7 cords last winter, keeping us barely warm. $56 we couldn't afford. And we were lucky. The Hendersons burned 9 cords. The Johnsons ran out in February and had to buy more at inflated prices. That money could have bought seed livestock medicine. Instead, it went up in smoke just to survive the cold. I understand that. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, the current system works fine for you and poorly for everyone else. What I'm building isn't a threat to your business. It's a solution to a problem that kills people every winter." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "Then," he said, 18 people died of cold-related causes in Ford County last winter. Hypothermia, frostbite complications, respiratory failures from living in houses that barely stayed above freezing. I knew those numbers. I never connected them to the cost of fuel. Connect them now, Mr. Hartwell, because if this works, I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Not to hurt your business, to save lives. Hartwell replaced his hat and mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he turned back. I hope it works, Mrs. Callahan, and I hope you understand that if it does, I'll have to find a way to adapt or fail. That's not a threat, just reality. I understand reality, Mr. Hartwell. I've buried 3 people this year. Reality and I are well acquainted. The limestone deposits ran along a creek bed 2 miles to the east. Flat slabs that split cleanly when she wedged Declan's old chisel into the natural fracture lines. She loaded them onto a sledge he had built for hauling supplies, hitched it to their remaining horse, a stolid mare named Bess, who had pulled the family wagon all the way from Missouri and made the trip twice a day until her hands cracked from the cold and her back felt like it might never straighten again. The wall construction began on October 1st. Each stone had to be selected for size and shape, tested for stability, fitted against its neighbors, with a precision that allowed no gaps. She stacked them dry, no mortar, the way her grandfather had described. Each course tilted slightly inward, 2 degrees off vertical, so the weight would press down and in instead of out and over. The walls grew slowly, 3 to 4 feet per day when the work went well. The base measured 18 inches thick, solid, immovable, the kind of foundation that would hold weight measured in tons. As the walls rose, she tapered them inward, reducing the thickness to 12 inches at the top. Less stone to carry, less weight to balance, but still strong enough to bear what was coming. On October 10th, Thaddeus Whitmore arrived with a wagon full of tools and his 16-year-old son, Edmund. Whitmore was a cattle rancher, 52 years old, who had claimed the section north of Moira's homestead 3 years earlier. He was a practical man, not given to sentiment, but he had seen enough hardship to recognize when someone needed help. Mrs. Callahan, he said, my wife Constance heard what you're building. She sent me to offer assistance. We can help haul the heavier stones when you get to the roof work. Moira climbed up from the pit. Why would you do that? Because Declan helped me when I first arrived here, showed me where the good water was, which land would hold cattle, how to survive the first winter. I owe him. I owe you. You owe me nothing. Then call it neighborliness. Call it whatever you want. But let us help. My boy, Edmund here, is strong as an ox. My younger son, Matthew, is 14, but useful. And my wife, he paused. Constance needs this. Needs to help someone. We lost people to the cholera too. Not family, but friends. Good people. Helping you helps her feel like she's doing something that matters. Moira felt tears prick at her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice. There's one more thing, Thaddeus said. I should tell you that Cornelius Hartwell came to see me last night. Asked me not to help you. Explained about the economic implications. Thought I should know what I'd be contributing to. And you're here anyway. I'm here because keeping people alive matters more than keeping someone's profit margins comfortable. Hartwell's not a bad man, but he's wrong about this, and I told him so. On October 14th, 3 things happened that changed the trajectory of everything. First, Moira arrived at her construction site at dawn to find that 12 of her carefully split limestone slabs had been damaged overnight. Not catastrophically, but enough to make them unusable. Clean breaks along edges that had been sound the previous evening. The kind of damage that could have been accidental stones shifting, settling, cracking from cold, or could have been deliberate. She examined the breaks carefully. The fracture patterns were wrong. Natural stone splitting followed the existing grain lines. These breaks cut across the grain. Someone had used a chisel, someone who knew how to work stone just well enough to make it look like accident. She said nothing about it, but she started bringing her tools inside the soddy each night instead of leaving them at the site. Second, Constance Whitmore came to visit, bringing her 4-year-old son, Tobias, and a basket of food. "Thaddeus told me what you're building," Constance said. "I wanted to see it for myself." She climbed down into the pit and ran her hand over the stone walls. Her face was thin, worry-worn. The cholera had taken their oldest daughter 2 years ago, and the grief lived in the lines around her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's functional." "It can be both." Constance looked up at Moira. "Thaddeus says you're doing this because of Declan and the children, because you can't stay where the memories are. That's part of it. The other part is that you're planning to survive this winter, alone, in an underground shelter that no one believes will work. Do you believe it will work?" Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe that a woman who can bury her entire family and still get up the next morning to dig holes in frozen ground has more strength than anyone gives her credit for. So yes, I believe you." Tobias, who had been peering into the pit with wide eyes, asked, "Why are you building under the ground, like a rabbit?" Moira smiled despite herself. "Because rabbits are smart. They know the earth stays warm when the air turns cold. They build where the temperature doesn't change." "Our house gets cold," Tobias said, with the brutal honesty of a 4-year-old. "Mama puts all the blankets on me, but I still get cold." Constance flushed. "Tobias, that's not—" "It's all right," Moira said. She looked at Constance. "How many cords do you have laid by?" 4. "Thaddeus says if we're careful, it might be enough. But last winter, we used 6 and still barely stayed warm. If this winter is colder—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Third, and most ominously, a town meeting was called for that evening at the church. 47 families gathered. Cornelius Hartwell stood at the front, not as an accuser, but as a man raising questions he believed needed answers. "We all know what Mrs. Callahan is building," he began. "An underground shelter with a corbelled stone roof, using techniques from Ireland from 1,000 years ago. I've spoken with her. I understand her reasoning. But we need to discuss the implications for this community." "What implications?" Someone called from the back. "If her shelter works, if it keeps her warm through winter, using a fraction of the firewood we currently burn, others will want to build the same. That's natural. That's sensible. But it has consequences." He laid out the economics plainly. His sawmill employed 8 men. Those men had families. If lumber sales dropped by even 30%, he'd have to let people go. Those families would have no income, no way to buy food supplies, pay debts. The ripple effects would touch everyone. "I'm not asking anyone to sabotage Mrs. Callahan's work," he said carefully. "I'm asking us to consider what we're doing, to understand that change has costs, and to be prepared for those costs." Thaddeus Whitmore stood up. "With respect, Cornelius, you're asking us to choose your business over people's survival, because that's what this comes down to. Survival. I'm asking for a middle ground, a way to preserve both. There is no middle ground. Either people freeze in expensive houses, or they learn to build better. You can't ask them to keep freezing, so you can keep selling lumber." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. But there were also faces that looked troubled. People who understood Hartwell's position, who knew that if the sawmill failed, the consequences would hurt everyone. Moira sat in the back, listening. She hadn't planned to speak. But the weight of all those eyes, the burden of what she was bringing into this community, without meaning to, pressed on her until she stood. "Mr. Hartwell is right about one thing," she said. "This will change things. I can't build this shelter and then refuse to teach others. That would be wrong. But I also can't not build it because someone's business might suffer. Because suffering is certain if I don't." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Last winter, 18 people in Ford County died of cold-related causes. 18. And dozens more suffered frostbite, respiratory damage illnesses that came from living in houses that couldn't keep them warm no matter how much wood they burned. That's the cost we're paying now. That's the middle ground we've been living with. And I won't accept it anymore. The gathering was silent. "If my shelter works, I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Free, no cost. Because knowledge shouldn't have a price when lives are at stake. And Mr. Hartwell," she looked at him directly, "you're a smart businessman. You'll adapt. You'll find other ways. But I can't let people die because you might have to change." She sat down. The meeting continued for another hour, but the core issue had been laid bare. Progress or preservation, survival or stability. The community couldn't have both. When people finally dispersed, Cornelius Hartwell waited until most had left. Then he approached Moira. "That was well spoken," he said quietly. "I meant it. I know you did. That's what worries me." He paused. "I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Callahan. But I can't be your ally either. Not when your success means my failure. I hope you understand that." "I do." "Good. Because I'll be watching. And if your shelter fails, if someone gets hurt, if this becomes a disaster instead of a solution, I'll make sure everyone knows. That's not a threat. Just fair warning." He walked away, leaving Moira standing in the empty church, wondering what she had set in motion. October became November. The walls stood complete. The core belling was set to begin on November 1st, exactly as she had planned. The night before, Moira lay in her sadi and listened to the wind howl across the prairie. In 90 days, the children's blizzard would arrive. In 90 days, everything she was building would be tested against cold that could kill in minutes. The earth was patient, the stone was ready, and Moira Callahan, widow daughter of Ireland keeper of old knowledge in a new world, closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow she would start placing stones in a pattern that had kept people alive for 1,000 years. Tomorrow she would test whether ancient wisdom could translate across oceans and centuries to this harsh Kansas prairie. And somewhere in town, Cornelius Hartwell sat at his desk doing calculations, figuring out how many cords of wood he could afford to not sell before he had to make impossible choices about which of his employees to let go. Two people, two different kinds of survival, about to collide in ways neither of them could fully predict. The wind kept howling, the prairie kept waiting, and the shelter that would save or condemn them all was about to take shape, one carefully placed stone at a time. November 1st, 1887, the first day of the core belling. Moira Callahan stood at the bottom of her excavation and looked up at the rectangle of sky that would soon be closed by stone. The walls around her rose 6 feet high, limestone, stacked in courses that leaned inward at precisely 2 degrees from vertical, 18 inches thick at the base, 12 inches at the top, where the core belling would begin. 576 cubic feet of empty space that would become, if her calculations and her grandfather's teachings held true, the warmest shelter in Ford County. The first core belling stone weighed 43 pounds. She knew because she had weighed it on the scale at the general store, enduring the curious stares. She positioned it carefully on the north wall, projecting exactly 2 inches inward from the top course below. She checked it with the plumb line, checked it again. The center of gravity had to remain over the wall beneath, or the entire principle collapsed. Too far in, and the stone would tip and fall. Not far enough, and the dome would never close. 2 inches. That was the mathematics of it. 22 layers, at 2 inches each, equaled 44 inches of horizontal span from each side. The opening was 8 feet across, 96 inches. The core belling from each side would meet in the middle with an opening of approximately 36 inches remaining. That final gap would be closed with capstones laid flat across the top. The physics was elegant. The execution was unforgiving. She set the first stone, then the second 3 feet to the right, then the third, working her way around the perimeter of the pit, each stone projecting inward, each stone tested and verified before moving to the next. By sunset, on November 1st, the first layer was complete. 28 stones forming a continuous ring that reduced the opening by 4 inches total. 21 layers remained, and 71 days until the blizzard. On November 3rd, Thaddeus Whitmore arrived with his 2 sons to help haul the larger stones from the limestone deposit. Edmund was 16, broad-shouldered from farm work. Matthew was 14, still growing into his frame, but strong and willing. They didn't talk much as they worked. Prairie men weren't given to unnecessary conversation, but their presence was a comfort Moira hadn't expected. She found herself looking forward to their arrival each morning, the sound of their wagon, the rhythm of shared labor. On the evening of November 3rd, after the Whitmores had left, Moira climbed up from the pit to find her water barrel overturned. Not tipped, overturned completely, the water soaking into the ground. The barrel itself moved 15 feet from where she'd left it. She examined the site carefully. Boot prints in the mud, larger than hers, a man's boots with a distinctive, worn pattern on the left heel. She memorized the pattern, said nothing to anyone. But she started arriving at the site earlier each morning, leaving later each evening, making her presence unpredictable. Layers 2 through 5 went up between November 2nd and November 5th. The work was slower than she'd hoped. Each stone had to be selected, position tested. Each layer required slightly more precision than the last, because the margin for error decreased as the dome closed inward. On November 6th, Constance Whitmore came to visit, bringing Tobias and food. "Thaddeus told me about the water barrel," Constance said quietly, while Tobias played at the edge of the pit. "He saw the boot prints when he arrived that morning. I noticed them too. Do you know whose they are? I have suspicions. Are you going to do anything about it?" "Keep building. That's all I can do." Moira paused. "If someone wants to stop me badly enough, they'll find a way, regardless of what I do. But I can't let the possibility stop me. Too many people need this to work." Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Our house barely reaches 35 degrees on cold nights." Tobias coughs from the damp chill. "I wrap him in every blanket we own, and he still shivers. Last winter, I thought we might lose him the way we lost his sister." "You won't lose him. I won't let that happen." "How can you promise that?" Because when this shelter is finished, when it's proven to work, you'll build your own. Or I'll help you build it. Or you'll share mine if necessary. But Tobias won't freeze. That I can promise. Tears filled Constance's eyes. Why are you doing this? You could leave Kansas. Go back east where it's easier, where there are houses and heat and no one trying to sabotage your water barrels. I'm doing this because I couldn't save Declan and Aisling and Brennan. But maybe I can save someone else's family. Maybe that's enough. Layer 7 went up on November 7th, and that evening, disaster struck. Moira had been working for 12 hours straight, her judgment dulled by fatigue. The stone she selected looked almond, but when she positioned it and stepped back to check the angle, she heard a crack like a rifle shot. The stone split vertically, and the entire northwest corner section of Layer 7 collapsed inward, taking Layer 6 with it. 6 days of work, destroyed in seconds. Moira stood in the rubble and made herself breathe. Fatigue was the enemy. Impatience was the enemy. She had let both get the better of her, and this was the consequence. She cleared the fallen stones, checked the underlying layers for damage, found that layers 1 through 5 remained intact. She would have to rebuild 6 and 7 completely. 3 days of work, minimum, assuming she didn't make another mistake. That night, she dreamed of Declan standing in the pit, looking up at her, his face gray with fever. "Why are you building this?" he asked. "Because I can't stay where we were. And you think stone will save you? I think stone might let me survive. That's all I'm asking for." She woke before dawn and returned to the pit. The rebuilding of layers 6 and 7 taught her something crucial. The large flat slabs were impressive, but unforgiving. What she needed were smaller wedge stones, triangular pieces that could be fitted between the large slabs to distribute weight more evenly and prevent catastrophic failure. She spent November 9th at the Limestone Creek, splitting stones into wedges. When she rebuilt Layer 6 on November 10th with the wedges interspersed among the large slabs, the structure felt different, stronger, more resilient. By November 12th, she was back on schedule. Layers 8 through 10 went up without incident. And then, on November 14th, she found the note. It was tucked between stones she'd stacked for Layer 11. A piece of paper, folded once, no envelope. The handwriting was careful, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Callahan, what you're building threatens good men's livelihoods. Their families depend on the lumber trade. I'm asking you to stop before it's too late. Before someone gets hurt. This isn't a threat. It's a warning. Winter is coming. Accidents happen in winter. Please reconsider." No signature, but Moira recognized the handwriting from store receipts, from notes left at the post office. She knew who had written it, even if she couldn't prove it. She crumpled the note and threw it in the fire that night. But the words stayed with her. Accidents happen in winter. She started bringing her dog a shepherd mix named Bear, who had belonged to Declan, to the site each day. Started varying her routine even more. Started watching the horizon for riders approaching. Layers 11 through 16 went up between November 13th and November 18th. The opening narrowed with each passing day. 96 inches became 84, became 72, became 60. The circle of sky, visible from the bottom of the pit, grew smaller. On November 19th, Cornelius Hartwell rode out to the site. He dismounted at the edge of the pit and looked down at Moira's work. His face was troubled. "I need to speak with you," he said. Moira climbed up. "I received your note, Mr. Hartwell." He blinked. "My note. The warning about accidents in winter. Mrs. Callahan, I didn't write you any note. I've been doing my accounting, watching my sales numbers drop, as people decide to wait and see if your shelter works. I've been calculating which of my employees I'll have to let go first, but I didn't write you any notes." Moira studied his face. He was telling the truth. She saw it in his eyes. "Then who did—" "I don't know, but I want you to know something. I oppose what you're building. I think it's going to hurt this community economically, but I'm not going to sabotage it. I'm not going to threaten you. If someone is doing those things, they're not doing it on my behalf. Why should I believe you? Because I'm here telling you this when I don't have to. Because whatever else I am, I'm not a coward who hides behind unsigned notes." He paused. "Be careful, Mrs. Callahan. You've kicked over an anthill. Not everyone who depends on the current system is as principled as they should be." He rode away, leaving Moira more unsettled than before. If not Hartwell, then who? Who had enough to lose that they'd resort to threats? On November 21st, Thaddeus Whitmore brought his 2 sons and his draft horse to help position the massive stones for layers 17 through 19. They had rigged a system of ropes and pulleys, a makeshift crane, using the horse's strength. The work went smoothly until mid-afternoon. Edmund was guiding a 200-pound slab into position when the rope frayed. Not broke frayed, as if it had been partially cut, and the remaining fibers couldn't hold the load. The stone swung sideways like a pendulum. Matthew was directly in its path, bent over adjusting a lower stone, completely unaware. Moira saw it happening, as if time had slowed. She lunged forward, grabbed Matthew's collar, and yanked him backward. They both went down hard. Moira's shoulder slamming into frozen ground. The stone crashed into the pit wall, where Matthew had been standing a second before gouging a deep scar in the limestone. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Thaddeus was there pulling his son up, checking him for injuries, his face white beneath the weathering. "God above," he whispered. "Matthew, are you hurt?" "No, Pa." Mrs. Callahan pulled me clear. Thaddeus turned to Moira, who was sitting up slowly, feeling where her shoulder had impacted. "You saved my boy's life." "Check the rope," Moira said. Her voice was steady, despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. "Check where it frayed." Edmund brought the rope over. The break was clean on one side, the natural fraying from stress. But on the other side, several strands showed cuts. Shallow cuts, as if someone had scored the rope with a knife, weakening it without making the damage obvious. "Someone tampered with this," Thaddeus said quietly. His voice had gone cold. "Someone tried to hurt my son." "Or me," Moira said. "Or both of us, to make a point about what happens when you go against the community interest. Do you know who—" "I have suspicions, but no proof. And proof wouldn't matter anyway. What matters is finishing the shelter before they succeed." The incident with the rope changed something fundamental. Thaddeus insisted on inspecting every tool, every rope, every piece of equipment before it was used. He and his sons started arriving earlier and staying later, keeping watch. Constance came by daily with food and presents, making it clear Moira wasn't alone. Even some of the townspeople who had been skeptical started showing support. Small gestures. A farmer leaving fresh venison at her site. A woman from town bringing extra lamp oil. A man she barely knew stopping by to say, "What you're doing matters. Don't let them stop you." Layers 17 through 20 went up between November 20th and November 24th. The opening narrowed to 48 inches. The dome was nearly closed, but the most critical work remained: the capstones. 6 massive slabs of limestone, each one measuring approximately 4 feet long by 3 feet wide by 4 inches thick. each one weighing more than 200 pounds. These would lay flat across the final opening, supported by the corbelling below, forming the center of the dome. Thaddeus brought his draft horse and all his rope on November 25th. They had learned from the frayed rope incident. Every line was inspected, every knot checked, every movement executed with extreme caution. The first capstone took 3 hours to position, getting it from the sledge to the ground, from the ground to the edge of the pit, from the edge down into the pit on a controlled descent. Then, the delicate work of maneuvering it into position on top of the corbelling, making sure it sat level, making sure the weight distributed evenly across the stones below. By the time it was in place, every muscle in Moira's body was screaming, but the stone sat solid, unmoved and unmovable. 5 more to go. The second and third capstones went up on November 26th, the fourth and fifth on November 27th. Each one requiring the same painstaking care, the same verification that nothing had been tampered with, the same fear that at any moment something would go catastrophically wrong. The sixth and final capstone was positioned on November 28th as the sun set and the temperature dropped below 0. When it settled into place, completing the dome, Thaddeus and his sons let out a collective breath they'd been holding for days. Moira stood inside her creation and looked up at stone where sky had been. She ran her hand over the smooth surface, feeling where each layer stepped inward, feeling the joints where the wedge stones had been fitted with such care. 22 layers, she said quietly. 576 cubic feet of earth removed. 1,100 stones placed. 92 days of work. And 45 days until the test, Thaddeus said. He was looking at a farmer's almanac he'd brought. If the weather patterns hold, the worst cold will hit mid-January. You'll know by then if this works. We'll know, Moira corrected. Because when it works, you're building one too. You and Constance and Tobias deserve to be warm. November 29th and 30 were spent covering the dome with earth. Bucket by bucket, shovel by shovel, Moira and the Whitmores moved the pile of excavated soil from beside the pit to on top of the stone roof, 3 feet deep across the entire surface, just as the Irish designs specified. When they were finished, the shelter was invisible from more than a few yards away. Just a slight rise in the prairie, a mound that could have been natural. Nothing to suggest that beneath that earth lay 5 months of labor, ancient knowledge translated across oceans, and a widow's refusal to accept that survival required suffering. The interior work took 3 days, December 1st and 3, a sleeping platform built from salvaged lumber, 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, raised 18 inches off the ground. Warm air rose. Simple physics. A tiny cast iron stove with a 12-inch firebox. The stovepipe ran through the wall and exited 20 feet away from the shelter entrance, preventing downdrafts. Storage niches carved into the stone walls, 12 inches deep, just enough for supplies. Dried goods, candles, matches, the Bible with Aishling's pressed flowers, Declan's book about Irish stone structures, a floor of packed earth covered with straw and canvas, insulation from the ground's cold, and the door, a wooden frame set into the southeast wall, facing the morning sun, facing away from the northwest winds, thick planks salvaged from the Saudi, leather hinges, a simple latch. On December 3rd, Moira moved the last of her possessions from the soddy to the shelter. She stood in the soddy's doorway one final time, looking at the space where her family had lived and died. "I'm not abandoning you," she said aloud to the ghosts only she could hear. I'm just trying to survive. I hope you understand." There was no answer, but then there never was. She closed the door and walked away. December 4th, 1887. The first night test. Outside temperature at sunrise, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Moira lit a small fire in the stove at 6 in the morning, just enough to take the edge off any residual chill. By 7, the inside temperature had reached 55 degrees. She let the fire die and went about organizing her supplies. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 52 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, 50 degrees. By sunset, 48 degrees. She didn't relight the fire. Outside, the temperature dropped to 4 degrees. Then 0. Then 2 below. The wind picked up howling across the prairie. In Thaddeus Whitmore's frame house 2 miles away, the indoor temperature dropped to 28 degrees, despite the fire burning in their stove. Constance wrapped Tobias in every blanket they owned and held him close. In town, in Cornelius Hartwell's house, built with the finest lumber his mill produced, the temperature dropped to 31 degrees. He kept the fire going at full capacity, watching his wood supply diminish, doing calculations about how many more nights like this they could endure. In Moira Callahan's underground stone shelter, the temperature at midnight was 47 degrees. She lay on her sleeping platform, wrapped in a single wool blanket, and listened to the silence. No wind, no creaking boards, no drafts, just silence and stillness, and a warmth that came not from fire, but from the earth itself, radiating back the heat of summer stored in stone and soil released so slowly it would last all winter long. She thought of Declan and Aisling and Brennan, of the graves that lay frozen in the cemetery. And she thought of what her grandfather had told her about the old beehive huts. The stone remembers. It remembers warmth, even in cold. And if you build right, if you understand what you're working with, the stone will keep you safe. Moira closed her eyes. For the first time since April, since the morning she had stood beside 3 open graves, she slept without nightmares. The shelter held, the temperature held, and somewhere in the friction between layers of limestone, in the air gap of the corbelled dome, in the 3 feet of soil that insulated against the cold, ancient physics and frontier necessity, had found their balance. 45 days remained until the blizzard. The shelter was ready, but Kansas wasn't done testing it yet, and neither were the people who had most to lose if it succeeded. In town, in a small office above the general store, someone sat writing another note. This one wouldn't be a warning. This one would be an ultimatum. December passed into January. The shelter held its temperature between 48 and 55 degrees, depending on whether Moira burned a small fire for cooking or let the earth's stored warmth sustain her alone. She used 1/8 of a cord of wood in those first 30 days. In previous winters, living in the soddy, she would have burned through nearly 2 cords by New Year's. Word spread. People came to see. Some were skeptical. Some were curious. Some were desperate for an alternative to burning through their winter savings just to survive the cold. On January 3rd, a delegation from town arrived at Moira's shelter. 5 men, including Cornelius Hartwell. They weren't hostile, but they weren't friendly either. They were calculating. "Mrs. Callahan," Hartwell said, "we need to discuss the spring." "What about the spring? How many families do you intend to teach? How many shelters do you plan to help build? As many as want to learn, as many as need the shelter. That's 14 families right now. Another 8 considering it. That's 22 potential shelters. Do you understand what that means for the lumber trade? I understand what it means for survival. I've had to let 3 men go already, just from the drop in winter, fuel sales, because people are waiting to see if your shelter works. If 22 families build these things, I'll have to close the sawmill. 8 families will have no income. The ripple effects will hurt everyone. Moira looked at the 5 men standing at her shelter entrance. Hard men, prairie men, men who had survived out here through will and work and the economic structures they'd built together. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "A compromise. Teach 5 families. Show it can be done. But keep it limited. Give the rest of us time to adapt. Time to find other markets, other ways to make the system work. And the families who freeze while you're adapting, they'll survive. They always have." "No," Moira said quietly. "They haven't always survived. 18 people died last winter. 18. And you want me to limit who I teach, so your business can adjust slowly, while people suffer, while children get frostbite, while families burn through money they don't have. We're asking for balance. You're asking me to let people die slowly instead of helping them live. The answer is no. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. I'll help build as many shelters as Kansas needs. And if your sawmill fails because of it, I'm sorry. Truly. But I won't trade lives for your profits." The delegation left without another word. But Moira knew it wasn't over. Desperate men did desperate things, and she had just made it clear she wouldn't be bargained with. On January 11th, the temperature rose to an unseasonable 38 degrees. Children walked to school in light coats. Farmers worked outside without gloves. There was talk in Dodge City of an early spring of luck finally turning. The barometric pressure was dropping, falling faster than any weather station had recorded. But the technology to interpret that data, to understand what it meant, didn't exist yet. The telegrams went out. Notes were made in logs. And the people of Kansas went to bed that night believing the worst had passed. At 2 a.m. on January 12th, Moira woke to bear growling, a low, sustained rumble that meant someone was near. She lit a candle and listened. Footsteps above, multiple people, moving carefully, trying to be quiet. She climbed the ladder and cracked the door open. 3 men stood on her mound in the moonlight. They had shovels, and they were digging. "What are you doing?" she demanded. The men spun around. She recognized one, a sawmill worker who'd been let go 2 weeks earlier. The other 2 were strangers to her. "We're fixing a problem," the sawmill worker said. His voice was slurred. They'd been drinking. "You won't stop, won't compromise. So we're going to stop you. By digging up my shelter. By showing everyone what happens when you go against the community. This thing collapses. Maybe you get hurt. Maybe you don't. But either way, no one's going to want to build one after they see it fail." Moira felt ice in her veins. "The stone roof is corbelled. You can't collapse it from the outside." "Maybe not. But we can expose it. Make it look unstable. Plant doubt. That's all we need." She should have been afraid. 3 men with shovels versus 1 woman alone in the dark. But instead, she felt anger. Pure, cold, clarifying anger. "Get off my property. Or what? You'll stop us. You're alone out here. No one's coming to help." She's not alone. Thaddeus Whitmore's voice came from the darkness. He stepped into the moonlight carrying his rifle. not pointed at anyone, just carried. A statement of presence. And neither are you, Thaddeus continued. There's 3 of you. And behind me, there's Edmund with my shotgun, and Matthew with Declan Callahan's old rifle, and my wife Constance with her daddy's pistol. She's a better shot than any of us. So you've got a choice. You can leave peacefully, or we can explain to the sheriff tomorrow why we had to defend our neighbor's property from drunk men with shovels. The 3 men looked at each other. The arithmetic was simple. They were drunk and angry. The Whitmores were sober and armed and had the law on their side. They dropped their shovels and left. Thaddeus waited until they were gone, then turned to Moira. You all right? How did you know? I didn't. But Edmund couldn't sleep. Said he had a bad feeling. We decided to check on you. Good thing we did. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank Edmund's bad feelings. He paused. This is going to get worse before it gets better, Moira. You know that, right? You've backed them into a corner. Desperate people don't think straight. I know, but I can't stop. Too many people need this. I know you can't. Just be careful, please. January 12th, 1888, 12 noon. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Moira felt it even underground. The shelter's temperature, which had held steady all morning, began to drop. 51 degrees, 50 degrees. Not fast, but noticeably. She climbed the ladder and opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical thing. 60 miles per hour or more, driving snow horizontally. The temperature had fallen from 38 degrees to -2 in the time it took to eat breakfast. The sky had gone from clear to white. Visibility measured in feet. Moira pulled the door shut and descended. The temperature inside was 49 degrees. She lit a small fire in the stove, just enough to counter the heat loss from opening the door. Within 30 minutes, the interior temperature had stabilized at 51 degrees. She sat on her sleeping platform and waited. Outside, the children's blizzard strengthened. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill was incalculable, unsurvivable. And across Ford County, in frame houses, in soddies, in structures built with the best lumber Cornelius Hartwell's sawmill could provide, people began to understand what cold could really do. 2 miles north, in this Whitmore household, Thaddeus woke at 3:15 in the morning on January 13th to the sound of Tobias coughing. Not the wet cough of illness, but the dry hack of cold, deep cold. He rose from bed and immediately saw his breath inside the house. The thermometer on the wall read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Constance was already wrapping Tobias in every blanket they owned. The boy's lips had taken on a bluish tint. His hands were ice cold. "Papa," Tobias whispered, "I can't feel my fingers." Thaddeus checked the stove. It was burning at full capacity, loaded with enough wood to last hours. The heat was pouring out and disappearing into the walls, into the roof, into the infinite cold that pressed against every surface. He checked their wood supply, half a cord remaining. At this rate, they had perhaps 36 hours before it was gone, and outside, the blizzard showed no signs of stopping. "We need to get to Moira's," Constance said. Her voice was steady, but he heard the fear underneath. "In this, we'd die before we got 100 yards. Then we stay and freeze." Thaddeus looked at his son, shivering despite the layers. At his wife, trying to be brave. At the stove consuming wood faster than they could afford, and still losing. "We wait until morning," he said. "If it's still this bad, we go. But we wait for daylight." Neither of them slept the rest of the night. In Dodge City, in Cornelius Hartwell's house, the situation was equally desperate. At 4:20 in the morning, Martha Hartwell woke her husband. "Millicent," she said. Cornelius looked at her feet. Their 6-year-old daughter had pushed off her blankets in her sleep. Her feet, exposed to the air, had gone white, the color of frostbite. Hartwell wrapped his daughter's feet in wool and carried her to the kitchen where the stove burned. The thermometer read 22 degrees. He added more wood. The stove was already at maximum, the metal glowing dull red, and still the cold was winning. He did the calculations. They had started the blizzard with 2.5 cords. In 15 hours, they'd burn through 1 cord. At this rate, they'd be out of fuel by January 15th. Martha wrapped Millicent's feet and held her close. "Will she lose her toes?" "I don't know. We need to get her to the doctor." In this storm, Hartwell looked out the window at white chaos, at wind that would freeze exposed skin in less than 2 minutes, at cold that could kill in 10. "No," he said quietly, "not in this storm." He added another log and watched 25 cents worth of wood disappear into heat that barely raised the temperature a single degree. At 9 o'clock on the morning of January 14th, there was a knock on Moira Callahan's door. She opened it to find Thaddeus Whitmore standing in snow up to his waist, his face wrapped in scarves, his coat covered in ice. Behind him, barely visible through the blowing snow, were Constance and Tobias, clinging to each other. "Our fire's dying," Thaddeus said. His voice was rough from breathing frozen air. "We're down to a 1/4 cord. Tobias is hypothermic. Constance," his voice broke. "Please, we need shelter." Moira didn't hesitate. "Get inside. All of you. Now." They stumbled down into the shelter. The temperature inside was 52 degrees. Tobias, who had been shivering violently, despite coats and blankets, stopped shivering within 5 minutes. His color began to return. His fingers, which had been white, slowly turned pink. Constance began to cry, not from grief, but from relief so profound it bordered on pain. "How?" Thaddeus asked. He was staring at the thermometer. "How is it 52 degrees in here when it's 50 below outside?" "The earth," Moira said simply. "The earth 6 feet down doesn't know it's winter. The stone holds that warmth. The soil insulates it. I'm not fighting the cold. I'm just letting the earth be what it is." Thaddeus touched the stone wall, cool but not cold. Not the bone-deep cold of the surface. "Can we stay as long as you need to?" At noon, there was another knock. Moira opened the door to find Cornelius Hartwell, his wife Martha, their 3 children, including Millicent, with her wrapped feet, and 3 other families she recognized from town. 12 people, total, counting herself. They stood in the snow, faces raw, from windburn eyes, desperate. Hartwell met her gaze. This man, who had opposed her work, who had economic reasons to see her fail, who had sent delegations asking her to compromise. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. He had to shout over the wind. "We have nowhere else to go. Our fuel's almost gone. The children," his voice broke. "Millicent has frostbite. Please, I know I have no right to ask. I know I fought against this. But please, just until the storm breaks." Moira looked at the crowd of people, at the children shivering, at Millicent's wrapped feet, at faces from the town meeting where they'd argued about economics and lumber sales and community costs. She stepped aside. "Get in, everyone." They came down the ladder one by one, like survivors boarding a lifeboat. When the last person was inside, and Moira closed the door, the shelter that had been built for one woman alone now held 12 human beings in a space measuring 8 feet by 12 feet. It should have been impossible suffocating, unbearable, but the temperature held at 54 degrees. The body heat of 12 people raised it slightly, but the stone absorbed the excess and radiated it back slowly. The air circulation through the vent pipe prevented stuffiness. The space was cramped, yes. People had to sit close, organize themselves in shifts for sleeping. But they were warm. For the first time in 24 hours, they were warm. Millicent Hartwell's toes slowly regained their color over the next 6 hours. The doctor would later write in his records that she had come within an hour of losing 3 toes, that whatever shelter she had found had saved her foot. They stayed for 6 days, January 14th through January 20th. The blizzard raged for 3 days, then slowly subsided. But the cold lingered. Outside temperatures remained below -30 degrees. No one could safely venture out. Inside the shelter, 12 people learned to live in close quarters. They slept in shifts, shared meals, rationed supplies. The children, after the initial trauma, began to treat it as an adventure. They played shadow puppets by candlelight, listened to stories, drew pictures in the condensation on the stone walls. The adults spoke in low voices, learned things about each other that proximity forced into visibility. And Moira, who had built this place to escape from people, to escape from memories, found that the presence of others was not the burden she had expected. On January 16th, Cornelius Hartwell asked her to explain the corbelling, not as a challenge, not as skepticism, but as a genuine student wanting to understand. Moira took a piece of charcoal and drew on a flat stone, showed him how each layer projected inward, how the center of gravity worked, how the weight became the strength. She explained thermal mass, earth insulation building, with the land instead of on it. Hartwell took notes, asked questions, made calculations. When she finished, he looked at her with something like awe. "This isn't luck," he said. "This is engineering. Ancient engineering, but engineering nonetheless. And it works better than anything we've built with modern methods. It works because it's been tested for thousands of years. The Irish didn't build these because they were romantic. They built them because they kept people alive." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about everything. I fought you because I was afraid of losing my business, afraid of change, afraid of admitting that maybe the way we've been doing things isn't the best way. Your fear was legitimate. My fear was selfish. 18 people died last winter. 18. And I knew that. I knew those numbers. But I was more worried about my profit margins than about those deaths. That's something I'm going to have to live with. What will you do after this?" "Help you teach. I own land with good limestone deposits. I'll provide stone at cost. My workers, the ones I didn't lay off, will help with construction. I'll still sell lumber, but for other purposes. And I'll adapt. Like you said, I'm a smart businessman. I'll find a way." He paused. "I owe you an apology. And I owe you more than that. I owe you my daughter's toes. Maybe her life. I won't forget that. I don't want you to owe me anything, Mr. Hartwell. I want you to help me teach this, to help make sure no one else has to choose between freezing and going bankrupt. I will. I promise you that." On January 20th, the temperature rose above zero for the first time in 8 days. The wind died. The sky cleared. Thaddeus Whitmore was the first to venture outside, digging through the drifts to confirm that the worst had passed. The families prepared to leave. Before they did, each one thanked Moira, some with words, some with gestures, some with tears. Millicent Hartwell, 6 years old, wrapped her arms around Moira's waist and held on. "You saved us," Martha Hartwell said simply. "The shelter saved you. I just built it. You built it when everyone said you were mad, when people tried to stop you, when it would have been easier to give up. That's what saved us. Not just the stone. You." After they left, Moira stood alone in her shelter for the first time in 6 days. The silence felt strange. Not peaceful exactly, but different. She thought of Declan, of Aisling and Brennan, of the graves that still needed flowers when spring came. "Maybe this is why," she said aloud to the empty shelter, to her family who couldn't hear. "Maybe this is why I survived when you didn't. So I could build this, so I could save them." There was no answer, but for the first time the silence felt like peace instead of absence. Spring 1888 brought transformation. 14 families came to Moira asking for designs, asking to be taught. She drew plans, explained the mathematics, supervised construction. Cornelius Hartwell provided limestone from his land. Thaddeus Whitmore organized labor crews. People who had been skeptical became students. People who had been afraid became builders. By summer 9, earth-sheltered structures had been completed. By fall 14, some were full underground shelters like Moira's. Others were hybrid designs, partially bermed with stone roofs, compromises between old knowledge and new preferences. The winter of 1888 to 89 tested them all. Average fuel savings, 4 to 5 cords per family. $32 to $40 kept in pockets instead of turned to ash. Across 14 families that represented $504. $504 that could buy seed, livestock, tools, medicine. Average indoor temperature improvement, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Frame houses that had struggled to reach 30 degrees now maintained 48, with earth-sheltered additions. Children slept without shivering. Elderly survived who might not have. Most significantly, 0 cold-related illnesses in the earth-sheltered homes. 0 cases of frostbite, hypothermia, or cold-induced respiratory disease. Compare that to 23 documented cases in frame houses. The data was undeniable. The technique worked. Cornelius Hartwell adapted. He shifted his business model, sold lumber for above-ground construction barns, fences, furniture, provided stone at cost for earth-sheltered structures, became a consultant on hybrid designs that used both timber and stone. His business didn't fail. It changed, and in changing it became more resilient than before. Moira Callahan lived in her underground shelter for 12 years. In 1900, she built a small frame house on the surface, but kept the shelter as a root cellar and storm refuge. She never remarried, not because she didn't heal from her grief, but because her life took a different shape. She became a teacher. 6 apprentices learned from her 3 men, 3 women, and they spread the knowledge further across Kansas, into Nebraska, into the Dakotas. Earth-sheltered construction became not a curiosity, but a legitimate building technique for prairie survival. In 1890, a tornado struck Ford County. 7 families took shelter in earth-bermed structures based on Moira's design. All 7 families survived unscathed, while frame houses around them were reduced to splinters. The shelter became proof of a principle that understanding nature was more powerful than fighting it. Moira died in 1924 at the age of 72. She was buried in the cemetery behind the church next to Declan Aisling and Brennan, the headstone paid for by the families she had taught, and the community that had learned to trust her, read simply, Moira Callahan. She built hope from stone. Her shelter was used for decades after her death. A farmer named Ezekiel Pritchard stored potatoes in it through the 1920s and 30s, marveling that the temperature never varied, that nothing ever froze or spoiled. In 1950, the Kansas Historical Society documented the structure. Photographs showed the corbelled limestone roof with no cracks, no settling, no deterioration after 63 years. The measurements were recorded. The technique was studied. In 2010, historians recorded the GPS coordinates 37.7528 degrees north, 100.0172 degrees west. The site was placed on the National Register of Historic Places as an example of immigrant building techniques adapted to frontier conditions. In 2024, 137 years after Moira Callahan dug the first shovelful of frozen earth, the structure still stands. The limestone has never leaked. The dome has never collapsed. The principles that kept Moira warm through the worst winter Kansas had ever recorded continue to work exactly as ancient Irish builders knew they would 1,000 years before America was named. Visitors sometimes find the site guided by GPS and by descendants who know the sound of the story. They descend the ladder into dimness and touch the corbelled stones and feel the constant 55-degree temperature that never changes summer or winter, year or century. They stand in that space and understand, perhaps for the first time, that innovation isn't always about the new. Sometimes it's about remembering what we've forgotten, about recognizing that the old ways survived because they worked, because they were tested not by theory, but by the most rigorous examination possible generations of human survival. The earth remembers what we forget. That shelter isn't about fighting nature, but understanding it. That warmth doesn't always come from fire. That the best solutions often lie not ahead of us, but behind us, waiting to be remembered. Moira Callahan didn't invent corbelling. She remembered it. And in remembering, she saved lives. Not just the 12 who sheltered with her during the blizzard, but the dozens who learned from her, and the hundreds who learned from them across decades and generations. Her shelter stands today not as a monument to one woman's ingenuity, but to a principle that outlasts us all, that knowledge freely shared across time and distance and culture is the greatest inheritance we can leave. The stone remembers. The earth remembers. And as long as the shelter stands, as long as people visit that GPS coordinate and descend into that carefully corbelled space, the memory of Moira Callahan will endure. The widow who dug what neighbors thought was her own grave and made it a home instead.